Welcome, my name is Joshua, and let's just get right into it. There is a growing idea that one can compartmentalize their faith. See, I may be a Christian over here, but that has no bearing on my politics. That is a completely false and absurd idea. Your theological persuasions engender your political persuasions. What you believe about God or the lack thereof will dictate what you believe politically, because the two in fact overlap at some point. Now, I've done an entire video entitled "Being a Conservative Does Not Make You a Christian." I cannot say that more loudly. Being a conservative does not make you a Christian. Not by a long shot. There are many conservatives, many Republicans who think that because they have sympathies towards certain biblical ideas that somehow has a bearing on their eternal destination. It does not. Being a Christian does not. Being a Republican or a conservative does not make you a Christian. I can't be more clear than that. But what about being a Democrat? Can I be a Christian and still vote Democrat or identify with or sympathize with the Democratic Party? My answer is yes. Yes, if truth means absolutely nothing to you. If integrity means absolutely nothing to you, or if you redefine the words Christian and or Democrat, then yes, you can be a Christian and vote Democrat. But if truth means anything whatsoever to you, you cannot, with a straight face, call yourself a true Christian or follower of Christ and adherent to the Bible and vote for or sympathize with the Democratic Party. It is impossible. So, on the one hand, there's no guarantee you're a Christian if you're a Republican, but it's an absolute certainty that you couldn't possibly be a Christian if you sympathize with the Democratic Party. Why do I say that? Well, the Democratic Party, as we know it today in America, progressive leftism in America, is a bizarre and confounding amalgam of various modes of political thought and worldview, including elements of socialism, communism, and even anarchy. The Democratic Party today should rightly be referred to as the kleptocratic party, because that's what it's characterized by: kleptocracy, not democracy. It is corruption and deceit at its core, at its foundation. Make no mistake, there are corrupt Republicans. There are many godless Republicans, but foundational to the Democratic Party are pillars that are antagonistic overtly and hostile overtly to biblical Christianity. What do you mean, Josh? Well, let's start with Hollywood, for example. Hollywood, perhaps, aka Vanity Fair, perhaps the most, the largest and most disconnected group of moral degenerates that America has to offer. They are unwaveringly behind the Democratic Party. Why is that? Well, there's a common bond. Right? The Bible says that friendship with the world is enmity with God, because the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life are all passing away, and they're not from the Father. Well, if anything could be characterized as from the world or of the world and lusting for pride and flesh, and it'd be Hollywood. Hollywood is an organization built on vanity and debauchery and greed, etc. So why is it there is so much simpatico between Hollywood and liberal Democrats? Well, it's because they're chasing after the same thing. To be a friend of Hollywood is to be an enemy of God. Now, Hollywood actors play pretend for a living. They take false realities and present them as though they were real, not unlike Democratic politicians who also play pretend for a living, and they take false realities and present them as though they were real. You can see the bond already. So if you call yourself a Christian, but you also vote Democrat, and you identify with and sympathize with the Democratic Party, you might want to ask yourself, why is it that you want what Hollywood wants? What is it that your Christianity has in common with Hollywood that you both want the same thing, the same lifestyle? Already, there should be a cause of concern if indeed you really claim to be a Christian. What does Hollywood have in common with your God? Well, if it's the God of the Bible, absolutely nothing. If it's a God of your own imagination, who knows how many similarities there might be. Now, Hollywood and the entertainment industry in general has become a tool in the arsenal of the Democratic Party. It was the 2014 Grammy Awards, I believe, where Queen Latifah presided over the gay and lesbian weddings of 33 different couples in the state of California. Arguably, the Democratic Party is the party of the LGBT movement. Yes, there are Republicans who sympathize with the LGBT movement. Even Trump was recently praised as being pro-gay. That is rather the exception, not the rule. For the Democratic Party, that is absolutely the rule. That's why the overwhelming number of people who identify as gay or lesbian are Democrats. They vote Democrat. This is not a big secret, and it's not up for debate. Everybody knows this. Hollywood is behind this. Now, the Bible clearly defines marriage as between a man and a woman, and in no uncertain terms says that those who practice certain things, certain lifestyles, including homosexuality, will not and cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. So you cannot believe a democratic narrative about a certain lifestyle and the Bible's narrative about the same lifestyle at the same time and in the same way. You have to pick one. God says this is abominable. The Democratic Party says this is great. Now, again, this is the rule, not the exception in the Democratic Party. How about genders? The Bible very clearly says God created men in his own image. Male and female, he created them. Male and female, not an allusion or anything else to something other than male or female. But it is the Democratic Party that is behind the gender fluid movement and gender identity and the real invention of genders nobody had ever heard of until a few years back. It's the Democratic constituency that is behind these things, not conservatives, not Republicans. You cannot have that and God's definition of gender, or rather sex, at the same time. They are mutually exclusive. God says one thing about the very nature of mankind, and the Democratic Party says a completely different thing, thereby calling God a liar. So you cannot sympathize with the Democratic Party without making God a liar. So if you call yourself a Christian and you sympathize with what Democrats say about gender or gay marriage, you make God a liar. Again, you'll have to call into question whatever it is you refer to as Christianity. Abortion, again, not a big secret. The Democratic Party is basically synonymous with the pro-choice movement. It is the Democratic Party who is behind extending the range of partial birth abortion and so forth. This has been going on for years. It is traditionally the Republicans and the conservatives that are trying to stop that. Again, there are exceptions to everything, but the rule within the Democratic Party is that reproductive rights, so-called, and abortion is championed. Women have the right to choose. This is a fundamental aspect of the Democratic Party. The Bible says the exact opposite. The Bible says that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, that we were knit together in the womb, that he covered our inward parts. And even in Luke chapter 1, Elizabeth is pregnant with John the Baptist, Mary is pregnant with Jesus, and Elizabeth says that the babe, John the Baptist, leapt in her womb with joy. He leapt in her womb with joy at the presence of the Messiah. There was an emotion ascribed to the baby in the womb. John the Baptist was filled with joy and leapt in the womb. You cannot ascribe those emotions and actions apart from personhood. The Bible is not ambiguous about how it describes personhood. People are people from the womb. The Democratic Party says the exact opposite. You cannot sympathize with the Democratic narrative and the Bible at the same time. So whatever you mean by Christian, if you sympathize with the Democratic Party, you need to evaluate your Christianity. How about racism? It is the Democratic Party who has been the champion of equality, or at least postured as such, and the ones who are trying to do everything to combat and militate against racism. It sounds noble on the surface. Unfortunately, the term racism has just been redefined somewhere along the way. Rarely, if ever, have you seen the word racism actually applied as it is defined. Look it up in Merriam-Webster if you wish, but racism has a very specific definition, and it is the belief that race is the primary determinant for traits and capacities. Let me say that again. It is the primary determinant for traits and capacities, and people are inferior or else superior on the basis of race because they have better mental faculties and emotional faculties and so forth. That's what racism means. It doesn't mean a disagreement between two people of opposing races. It means that one person must enunciate or at least strongly imply that they believe that their race is better because the other person is limited by virtue of their race. Now, Trump is often labeled a racist. Donald Trump, of course, not the only person, but the most prominent, surely. But has anybody ever heard Donald Trump say out of his mouth that he believes that race is the primary determinant for human traits and capacities? Has anybody ever heard him say that? No, because he's never said it. But that doesn't stop the liberal left and Democrats from applying the term racism to Donald Trump. What's this got to do with the Bible? God is not the author of confusion, number one. The Bible says that. It also says that the Lord detests differing weights and measures. He finds them an abomination. They are an abomination to the Lord to use double standards. Jesus didn't have nice things to say about hypocrites in the New Testament, and the Bible says that all liars will have their part in the lake of fire. So there is either a profound ignorance of what the word racism actually means, or there's a lie going on, some kind of con game with words, and double standards being applied to indict people for charges of which they are not guilty. That's also called false witness. We can approach this from several different angles. The point is, racism has a specific meaning, and it was derived from an earlier word called racialism. Racialism. Racism, as we know it in written form, really wasn't seen until the late 1930s, and it was applied almost exclusively to the relationship between Adolf Hitler and the Jews. It was called Nazi racism, which came from the earlier term racialism, which asserted the same thing. A racialist was one who believed that race is what determined your mental capacity and other traits. That's what racism means. It doesn't mean anything outside of that. But when have you seen a Democrat apply racism as it actually stands, in a context in which it's actually applicable? I haven't seen it. And yet the term racism is so prevalent now. It's astounding. Now, where did the idea of racism come from? Now, we know it was clearly in the context of Nazis. Adolf Hitler was not shy about his notion that there was indeed a superior race to be made and that inferior ones needed to be exterminated. Nazi racism. But a man, not quite, but about 100 years before him, Charles Darwin, was also very much a racist and also a hero of the Democrats. It's Charles Darwin that is pushed into schools and God that is pushed out. What your liberal NEA member teacher probably never told you, what your hippie anthropology professor probably never told you, is that Charles Darwin, the father of Darwinian evolution, the new god of the school, was a racist. Not a little racist, an outspoken and rank racist by any standard, no matter how you slice it. Yes, Charles Darwin was a racist. His famed book On the Origin of Species was not the original title, nor is that the full title. The original title reads On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Did you catch that? The preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Yes, Darwin thought that certain races were favored, and he disdained others. Among them were Polynesians, American Indians, Eskimos, and even Australians, whom he referred to as savages of inferior intellect and moral depravity. He thought all of these groups were inferior. And he said the same thing of black people. He thought that mental capacity, that virtue and integrity were things that were exclusive to Europeans. This is the Charles Darwin that your teacher probably never told you about. This is the Charles Darwin that is a hero of the left. God is not the author of confusion, and he detests differing weights and measures. So the same people that decry racism elevate Charles Darwin to a near God-level status, all the while failing to tell you that his theory was predicated upon racist ideology, not scientific inquiry and logical deduction, but racism. Charles Darwin was a racist. Well, how about Black Lives Matter? Okay, Black Lives Matter is an offshoot of the Democratic Party. It was co-founded by three women, the two of whom were Patrice Cullors and Alicia Garza. Black Lives Matter, very obviously part of the Democratic constituency. It's an offshoot of the Democratic Party and liberal ideology in general. Patrice Cullors said in an interview that her and her friend Alicia, specifically 2/3 of the founding members of Black Lives Matter, are trained organizers and trained Marxists.
I also think that it might, I think of a lot of things. The first thing I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists, are trained Marxists, are trained Marxists.
Marxists. She said we are trained organizers and trained Marxists. Now, Karl Marx, for those of you that don't know or haven't cared to know, was the co-author of the Communist Manifesto with his pal Friedrich Engels. Karl Marx was also a racist, and so was his friend Friedrich. Now again, Black Lives Matter says out of their own mouth they are trained Marxists. Inherent to the ideology and the philosophy of Marxism is racism. Behind communism are two racists. Karl Marx was an outspoken anti-Semite who called Mexicans lazy. His friend Friedrich Engels took it a step further and used the N-word quite often. You see, Karl Marx had a son-in-law who was, according to Friedrich Engels, perhaps 1/12 N-word blood. That's how he phrased it in an 1887 letter. Well, Karl Marx's son-in-law was the candidate for a seat in a district of Paris, which also had a zoo in it, okay? A real zoo. Karl Marx's friend and co-author, Friedrich Engels, wrote that because he was, well, let me read you the quote. Here's the exact quote. Being in his quality as a N-word, a degree nearer to the rest of the animal kingdom than the rest of us, he is undoubtedly the most appropriate representative of that district. Well, that's nice. I wonder if the Black Lives Matter representatives would care to explain to us why they profess to be trained Marxists, and yet the Marxists that they so admire were overt racists who compared black people to animals in a zoo. This is readily available if you'd care to do the research. My point is, what you see from the Democratic Party and from liberals in general is marked by confusion, hypocrisy, double standards, lies, ignorance, etc., etc. Doesn't mean that there's not Republicans who exhibit those things. It means that it is part of the character that the Democratic Party is founded upon. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were racists. But how about some of their successors? People like Che Guevara, another hero of the left. I'm sure you've seen this t-shirt before. If you've sat at a coffee shop at any point in a liberal city, right, you've probably heard a bunch of suburban white kids talking about fighting against the system while wearing that t-shirt. These are Democrats, by and large. They are of the Democrat constituency. They are liberal-minded. Well, Che Guevara, another hero of the left, was not only a murderer, but an outspoken racist. In his 1952 memoir, The Motorcycle Diaries, he said this, and I quote, "The Negro is indolent and lazy and spends his money on frivolities, whereas the European is forward-looking, organized, and intelligent." Another hero of the left, a clear racist. What the word actually means, not a redefinition of the word racism. The examples I'm giving you are definitional examples of racism. From Charles Darwin to Karl Marx to Friedrich Engels to Che Guevara to Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, who considered Negroes weeds that needed to be uprooted, to, I don't know, the Ku Klux Klan, which is also a part of the byproduct of the Democratic Party. You can see the inherent confusion, contradiction, hypocrisy, lies, etc., that stem from these movements. This is inherent to the Democratic Party. God is not the author of confusion. You cannot sympathize with people who claim to be fighting against race while also at the same time promoting some of the most outspoken and overt racists in history. Moreover, the trained Marxists of the Black Lives Matter movement would be incompatible with biblical Christianity on another account. Here's a quote from Karl Marx, who said, "The theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property. That's from Karl Marx himself. Patrice Coolers said she's a trained Marxist. Well, then she must be trained in the notion of the abolition of private property, because Karl Marx said communists can be summed up in just that one sentence. What does the Bible have to say about private property? Among other things, it pronounces a curse on those who would dare to move the landmark and alter private property. It says not to remove the ancient landmark. In Acts chapter 5, a man named Ananias and his wife Sapphira sold a piece of land, came to bring the proceeds to the apostles, but they held back some of the money secretly. And Peter makes it very clear that while the land was their own and in their possession, they were free to do whatever they wanted with it. The apostle Peter assumed that private property was a thing. Karl Marx did not. Black Lives Matter must not, because they're trained Marxists after all. So another element of Democrat thinking that is woefully incompatible with biblical Christianity. You cannot be sympathetic to these ideas and the Bible simultaneously. You must pick one. So if you call yourself a Christian and you sympathize with Karl Marx the racist, or Charles Darwin the racist, or Che Guevara the racist, or Karl Marx the anti-private property man, whatever you call yourself, you cannot call yourself a Christian. You might want to reevaluate your Christianity. The Democratic Party is the party of welfare. It's the party that promotes the welfare state. The Apostle Paul says, whoever doesn't work, neither shall he eat. There is a difference between charity and a welfare state. And compulsory charity is no longer charity. We could go on and on. How about borders, open borders? The Democrat Party is a party of open borders. They oppose the wall that Trump would dare to build around this great nation. How dare he? That is radically inconsistent with the foundation of this nation, they say. I'll tell you what it's not inconsistent with. It's not inconsistent with the Bible. So if you call yourself a Christian, you do believe in borders, because heaven itself has a wall, quite a big wall, and gates. The book of Revelation not only speaks about the wall a couple of times, but measures. We have actual dimensions of this massive wall and the gates that are around it. And moreover, it says that any who defile or cause an abomination or a lie will be shut out. They will not be allowed in. They will be kept out by a big wall and big gates. Well, here, remember, some of the things God thinks are an abomination would be differing weights and measures. That's not going in heaven. People who lie about definitions and things, the Bible says all liars will have their part in the lake of fire. That's not going in. Whatever defiles, I don't know, like Charles Darwin and Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx, people who sympathize with those ideologies, that's not going in heaven. And yet these are things that are promoted by the Democratic Party. Those who think that babies are not human in the womb, that's not going in heaven. Those that think there are more than two genders, well, you must call God a liar. So how is he going to let that in heaven? That's not going in heaven. So all of the things that we've just discussed, and there are many more, are fundamentally incompatible with biblical Christianity. And these are things that are fundamental to the Democratic Party. So again, I say, being a Republican is no indication that you're a Christian. However, you can be a Christian and still vote Republican or sympathize with it superficially. But the Democratic Party, from start to finish, promotes some of the most overtly hostile and antagonistic concepts to biblical Christianity in the world today. So if you call yourself a Christian, you could not possibly call yourself a Democrat or sympathize with the Democratic Party and liberal politics. It is impossible. Whatever you might want to call yourself, you can't call yourself a Christian. So, some things to think on. There's an important election coming up, and if you spend more time on politics, trying to understand politics and political discourse than you do trying to understand the Bible or biblical discourse, I would submit that your focus is misplaced already. But as this is an important topic, and people seem to be growing in the notion that they can compartmentalize their faith and believe in the Bible here, but also believe in this here, I'm here to tell you, you cannot. You cannot be a Christian here and not a Christian here. The ideas overlap. Democrat and Christian? I don't think so. Until next time, God bless and Godspeed.